I'm John Stotts, Director of Adult Faith Formation here at Christ the King. If I haven't met you, and if this is your first time, welcome. And if you've been coming all along, welcome back. In many ways, I've seen this as the highlight of our discussion so far. So I hope that we can take advantage of the expertise sitting at this table and the experience. I'm hearing a little feedback. Yes? Let me see what I can do. This is the first time I've rigged up 3 mics to...
That's good.
Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. So I want to begin with a moment of silence. Obviously, if any of you have been paying attention to the world, yesterday saw unprecedented, well, to some degree, attacks back and forth across the Gaza Strip. Things are still developing, and we're going to have a moment of silence in which we can collect all of our prayers for peace and justice and all else. That said, we're not going to spend an inordinate amount of time on that conflict this morning. I checked with our guests this morning. None of them is policy analysts. None of them have any particular expertise in what's going on in Israel from a political perspective. And we haven't asked them to speak for all Jews everywhere this morning, but out of their own particular experience. So while we may touch on aspects related to Israel and the life of ordinary Jews in Nashville, we're going to table analysis of the events of this weekend with your permission. That's just not the best use of our time. So let us pause for a good minute, asking the one God for all that we need in this moment of violence and tragedy. Amen. So here's the agenda for this morning. With your help last week, I've put together a list of questions that emerged from our table discussions and some other things that have come up. Thank you to those of you who kindly emailed me afterwards as well. They've had a chance to review these questions, so they have a little bit of preparation. So we're going to spend the bulk of the time on those questions, which are all very good. And then depending on the energy and the flow, towards the end, I'll open it up to questions from you all. I want us to remember that we've asked these friends here to speak out of their own particular experience. Again, we're not asking them to speak for all Jews everywhere. That would be impossible to do. We also want to make good use of our time. So let's maybe pivot around questions that could be answered with Google. Anything from when was Rosh Hashanah? Questions that don't rely on their particular experience that we could actually solve ourselves, and focus on questions relating to what it's like to grow up Jewish in Nashville, anything related to that, what Jewish observance looks like. We really want to make good use of our time with our panelists. Any questions or suggestions? Okay, sounds good. So I will ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves with as much or as little identifying information as they like, and then we'll move into the questions. Go ahead, Jimmy.
So we drew lots, and I got to go first. Good morning, and thank you for having us here, John. Especially appreciate you organizing this series. Can't tell y'all how meaningful it is being a Jew in Nashville to see your church reach out in this manner. So appreciate it. Most of you know me as being married to Torah scholar that you met a couple weeks ago. I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. My congregation is called Mikveh Israel. It's one of the oldest congregations in America. Jews came to Savannah in 1733, right after James Oglethorpe settled Savannah. He was a fairly enlightened individual. It was an open community. Jews were welcome there. And being a port city, it was a diverse community. And while it's Southern in nature, it was also receptive to Jews as a whole. We were a distinct minority. We were a small portion of the community. And so a lot of the questions that were, when's your first experience with Christianity or Catholicism? Well, when you're born as a distinct minority, your first experiences are as soon as you start interacting with the community around you. But I didn't experience any overt anti-Semitism in Savannah. There were people that were clearly anti-Semitic. The one that I remember most is J.B. Stoner, who used to publish a magazine called The Thunderbolt, and we would occasionally receive those on our front lawn. But other than that, my memories of Savannah and growing up in that community was it was a wonderful life, and I had no real experiences that I can reflect on that really were kept me from being a part of the community.
I am Lynn Barton, and you will meet my husband, David, in just a minute. And we are both from Selma, Alabama, which at the time we were growing up there was a completely segregated town into blacks and whites. And since we were white, we were treated without discrimination in my mind. We belonged to the country club. I belonged to the girls club. My brother, not I, which I've never gotten over, was president of the student council and homecoming king and all that. But it was sort of an idyllic life. I really did not feel that different, I think, until I went to college. And I went to college up in the Northeast. And at that point, nobody believed that anybody from the South was Jewish. They just weren't Jews in the South as far as they were concerned. And my name was Palmer, and I whatever it means, have been told that I don't look Jewish, which is kind of, I think, I'm not sure if that gets into stereotypes, but so I think for the first time, I didn't quite know what to do with being Jewish. And because nobody knew I was, and so do you say, hello, I'm Lynn, I'm Jewish, or do you not? And so I think that was really, even more than growing up, the first time I was aware, and that I might have heard comments, not overtly anti-Semitic, but something just about Jews. Oh, he's a Jew or she's a Jew, and who do I date, or do I didn't quite know what to do with it. So I think that was probably for me the first time I began to be aware of being in a minority and maybe being different. So I'm going to stop there and let David take it.
Well, as you can see, I'm from Selma, Alabama also. My name is David Barton, and as you can see, I found a Jewish woman in Selma, Alabama to marry, and did. However, it's interesting, I had never gone out with a Jewish woman except my second cousin. Sorry, I'm from Selma. And I had never gone out with one till I went to college. Let me get a little closer here. I have a very thick Southern accent, by the way, and if anybody, I won't feel hurt at all if you ask me to say that again. I practiced professionally as a psychiatrist, and I always said people could understand only about half of what I said, and that made me a good psychiatrist because they could make up their own interpretations of what I was saying. I don't want to be the stand-up, sit-down comic here, but they know my personality, okay?
That's why I have a clock.
Lynn asked me on the way over here, breakfast this morning, she said, do you think we should take our time on it? And I knew what she was telling me. So, but I said, no, I have my watch and I think I can do it. I grew up in a Reform temple. We call the Reform temples, and the synagogues, conservatives are generally called synagogues, and Orthodox temples, Orthodox edifices are called shuls. So there's a distinction in the level of observance right there. My great-grandfather was one of the first rabbis in Selma on my mother's side, and my mother's side, we probably won't get to talk of this. Her maiden name was, that she handed me the watch, was Gustolf. So she was a German Jew, and we probably won't get to talk too much of this. About this, my father immigrated to this country from Poland when he was 8 years old to Selma, Alabama. His father was a cobbler and was brought to Selma to repair shoes. They subsequently went into the mercantile business. As for, so I'm really first generation, sort of, and my brother and I were. I probably think it's important to mention that you've got 3 Southern Jews up here. And that's going to make a difference. I think if you had 3 Jews from New York City sitting here, that you might get a different view of our integration, if you will, or our assimilation into the Gentile population. I was extremely, our family, like Lynn's family, was very much assimilated. And except for there were not that many Jews around. Well, there were a lot of Jews around, but not that many Jewish women my age. Like Lynn, when I went to college, and I went to the University of Alabama, when I went to college, it was like somebody put a giant fence down, and the fence, the Jews were on one side and the Gentiles were on the other side. But a lot of my friends from Selma went to Alabama who were Gentiles, and so I was very assimilated there also. I have experienced considerable amount of anti-Semitism in my life, but some in Selma, most in other places, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and I need to stop.
I think both David and I, and possibly Jimmy too, we grew up in smaller towns. In cities, bigger cities, even in the South, there were Jewish country clubs, Jewish sororities in high school. So Jews were more cordoned off than they were in the smaller towns. In the smaller town, I grew up, David did, I don't know about Jimmy, going to YMCA camp. We know all, Jesus Loves Me, on Old Rugged Cross, all of the songs. I grew up going to Methodist Bible schools. We had a teacher in those days that came to our school once a week, Miss Smith, and taught Bible with her felt board. And so every Easter we would learn the story of the resurrection. At Christmas we learned, and it came to pass, we memorized that in public schools. So it was very much a growing up in a Christian world. And I think for all of us, that's what we all did, and that's what Jews do. We all grow up talking about BC and AD. That's not very Jewish, before Christ, the year of our Lord. In God we trust. I don't think that's a Jewish God necessarily, a Muslim God. It's more a Christian God. So and particularly, I know we'll get to this in the South, you grow up with the real God being Friday night football. And that's a problem if you're a Jew. That's when we're supposed to be in temple. And Saturday, which is in Alabama football, which is just about as bad. So those kinds of things that we've had to deal with all along would be something that probably most people don't think about. So there are a lot of those things, and we'll probably get into some of that.
Let me just say one quick thing. It is true, though, very early, I can remember in the second grade when the Lord's Prayer was said every morning. My second grade teacher, Ms. Butler, whom I loved, asked me, would you like to go outside while we say the Lord's Prayer? And right there, there's some sense of being different, if you will, since I was the only Jewish kid in the class. However, I can really say the Lord's Prayer because I studied it. And I can sing it too.
Yeah,
But I always tell people that I've not been any the less for it, I don't believe. But our assimilation, our whiteness, if you will, was very interesting. And I just finished, I did a course on whiteness for Jews. Jews 100 years ago they're seen as Hebrews and kind of set aside. We never had that experience, really, except a few times when I had some kind of incident with someone where they did anti-Semitic.
I want to continue with this theme of assimilation. And I want us to think about kids. So could you share with us, either from your perspective as a child growing up in a Jewish home, but going to a public school or being around Christians, or your experience raising kids and sending them out into the world? What were some of the challenges? You've already mentioned football. You can talk more about that, but what were some of the challenges as you raised kids or grew up as a kid, maintaining your Jewish identity? What were the main conflicts? And did you ever feel a sense of challenge from the wider society to change, to not be different anymore?
Well, during the period of growing up, there was a feeling among many Jews, this was post-World War II, that they wanted to, at least our parents, fought in the war. They wanted to come home. They wanted to start a life, start a family. And there was a strong feeling to assimilate into the broader society. And so I did go to public school, and the feeling was to not be different. So in that regard, there was an effort on my parents' part. I mean, we had, basically tried to live within the community. I think to just give you an example of where there's hard decisions to be made, Christmas is a big dilemma for Jewish families. How to deal with, and it's just gotten bigger and bigger, this period of time where clearly we are other. It's not a holiday we normally celebrate. If you're in the retail business, you celebrate Christmas. I mean, and truthfully, we had a Christmas tree growing up. It was fun. It was Santa Claus. It was gift giving. It was not religious. Once my sister started dating a boy who was conservative, we had to be sure that we could not put the tree up until he had left Christmas Eve, and we had to have it down before he came for lunch on Christmas Day. So, it is probably the one period where we had to make a decision for our kids. How are we going to treat this period? And for ours, we decided early on that we weren't going to have Christmas in the house, and we would celebrate Hanukkah. The problem with that is that Hanukkah is not an equivalent. It has been made to be an equivalent because with gift giving and all that, but it is a very minor holiday. It's actually not, it celebrates a military victory. It's not really, there's been some effort to assign something more to it, but that is a big, obvious period when you're raising kids. How do you talk through what Christmas is and what it's not? And so you run into those on a lesser degree every day, possibly, whether a child's confronted at school or they decide to have exams on the holidays or parties or proms on holidays. These are the things that you just have to deal with in explaining to your children, how to live within this Christian community, but still retain your Jewishness.
Can I ask a clarifying question about holidays? So for Catholics in the room, if there's a football game, but that Friday is Immaculate Conception, Catholics just have to make sure to get their Mass in, right? So they can go early in the morning, there are a variety of things. I'm getting the sense that Jewish observance of the holidays is slightly different than just making sure to get to church for an hour. Could you say a little bit more about what that looks like and why it's a problem when there are things like exams or football games or other requirements on Jewish holy days?
Well, we only have, it seems like we have a lot of holidays, but there are only a few where the day is set aside. And they happen to fall early in the school year. Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we just celebrated, these are full day or maybe 2-day celebrations. So for Rosh Hashanah this year was a Friday night. And it starts sundown. Your holiday starts on the sundown and goes through sundown. So when we said Rosh Hashanah starts on Friday, it starts Friday night and it runs through Saturday night. Rabbi Saul, when he's here and he's talking about high holy days, will probably say there's 2 nights or 2 days. So, you have to be at services. I mean, there's one service Friday night, and then there's a morning service on Saturday, and you spend the afternoon with family and friends on Rosh Hashanah. On Yom Kippur, it's a day of personal reflection. You're supposed to set aside the day and not do anything other than, reflect upon your year, upon your relationships with others. And it's really a gift to yourself to set aside this time. And so, again, it starts with a big service on the night of Kol Nidre. It's a very solemn service. It's a beautiful service. And then all day, the next day, you're spent in reflection and in service. So when that falls during the week, you're out the whole day from work. You shouldn't be going to work and dealing with work matters. And And so those are the two primary days of the year. They just happen to fall during the school year early on and when things are happening in September and October. So I don't know if that helps understand the focal point. It's not unlike any, I'm sure Easter is similar,
No, Easter's always on a Sunday.
but it's arranged to fall on a Sunday.
Yeah. And they get Christmas holidays. So you're always out for Christian holidays, well, the Easterns and Christmas, the big ones. And I agree with Jimmy, it's the hardest thing about raising kids other than Christmas, is that trying to educate the school systems. New York will do it. New York, where there's so many Jewish people, they cancel schools. It's like Christmas holidays, only it's just Jewish holidays. But to try and convince MBA or that they shouldn't have their homecoming on the eve of Yom Kippur. I think one year they were playing Ryan, actually. And so many kids want to be at those games that to try, it just becomes a battle. And Friday, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, is really the holiest time, and that's every Friday night. And so there's just no way to get around it. And to convince teachers that it's not only important not to schedule big exams on, say, Yom Kippur, but they think, okay, we won't do that, we'll do it the day after. So that means if you're going to have a big exam the day after, you're supposed to be studying for that exam on Yom Kippur, which really isn't much better. And it is, people don't keep up with those holidays in the school system. And in most places, if you don't celebrate them, you don't keep up with them. So I think raising children and trying to have them feel not like the other and not hate being Jewish because they couldn't go to homecoming, or hate being Jewish because they couldn't go to a big party. You really struggle with those decisions for their whole life. 7th grade for kids is probably about the best because that's when they're all bar and bat mitzvah and all their kids come, and the whole year is bar and bat mitzvah parties. So 7th grade is usually better. But other than that, being Jewish, particularly in a public school system, but in most private schools as well, it is problematic.
I think the interesting thing to me about my growing up was how my parents managed to maintain our Jewish identity. They didn't do such a good job with my brother, but with me they did. My brother was older and subsequently converted to one of the Protestant religions. But also, I think, an effect of assimilation. But for me, they seem to have really both made us feel different in some ways, being Jewish, but made us feel the same, so that we were able to have a tremendous amount of interaction in the Gentile community, and our fluidity was amazing. I always valued that in terms of the ability to relate with almost anybody I wanted to relate with. And they brought that about. But for instance, my father insisted, and I never figured this out, but he never wanted me to play Joseph in the Christmas play. And so it was that kind of thing. He never wanted there to be a star on top. We had a Christmas tree also. He never wanted me as children, to put a star on the top of the Christmas tree. So it was always a little bit short of being a full-time Christmas, if you will. The interesting story I love to tell is the rabbi in Selma used to make rounds and go around to all the houses to see who had Christmas trees. And when he came to our house, we had a little sunroom off of out of our living room where the Christmas tree was. And my father hurried and got some sheets and threw them over the Christmas tree. And there the rabbi, and he made sure the rabbi sat with his back to the Christmas tree. And I never could understand it because there was this conical, absolute certain Christmas tree sitting there. But the rabbi seemed not to pay any attention to it either.
Following this line of thinking, can you tell us a little bit about the story of Christianity as you experience it? That is based on what your parents said, what you grew up learning at temple or synagogue. What was the account of why there are Christians, and how did that fit into your understanding of what it means to be Jewish? Does the question make sense?
Well, it came to pass. I think we all knew about Jesus growing up, and we knew that you all thought he was the Son of God and came down, and he was born of a virgin and he died on the cross. And it's pretty hard to grow up and not know that. But I think, we didn't talk a lot about it. It was not something that we talked about really all the time in our homes. It's just that everybody was Christian. So not in our family, but everybody we knew was Christian. So, and as I said, we went to the Bible schools and summer Bible schools and had Miss Smith, who they called Booby Smith because she had very big breasts. And she would come every week on Tuesday. And so it was always just it was like in the water. I think that's what it's probably hard. It is so in your water, you don't think about it being in other people's water. But when you live in America, everything is Christian. And if you're not that, then you are something else. And so we know all about y'all. I think you don't know as much about us. So it's how we convey that in a way that helps you understand what would be important and what's not important. But I think as Jews, particularly, I think you may hear from Rabbi Saul, who grew up more in a Jewish world in the north, that he probably didn't think as much about Jesus anyway. We always thought about Jesus because Jesus is Jesus. So, but Jesus is a Jew, was a Jew. The words Jesus spoke were Jewish. Jesus never said anything I don't think Jews of that day would not agree with, or if they didn't agree with it, it would be because he was more forward-thinking than some of the Jews of that day and was, again, trying to lead them down a more egalitarian path than some of them were following, just like I think there's a difference now in Reformed Jews and Orthodox Jews, and we think in a different way than they think. So I don't know that we don't think about Christians, or we do.
Has anyone ever tried to earnestly convert you to Christianity?
Yes.
No.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I know you're yes.
Or Jimmy, did you have something to say on the previous question?
I did.
Yeah.
The idea that there's some connection between Christianity and Judaism in our story is not a Jewish thought. There is no connection. Our faith is absent Jesus. And I think while there may be a historical connection, there's not a faith religious connection. So, at least from a Jewish perspective. From a Christian perspective, I don't know how you view Judaism, but Jesus and all of that is not a part of our story. It is not a part of our faith. Just like Muhammad and Islam is not a part of our story, supposedly the same God, but not part of our faith. John Smith is not a part of our story. So for the question to say that Jesus is somehow, what are we taught about Jesus? It's not a part of our faith. And so we may, I mean, I went to Y Camp, yeah, but Jesus is not in our story. It's not in our faith. And so our belief is in one God, that we're all looking to connect with God. You may put Jesus' face on God, and others have different names for God. We believe that we're all on our own path, our individual path. And for those that believe in Jesus and it allows them to engage in God, that's wonderful. I mean, it's not a threat to me. And when you have that mindset that we're all on our own path, we're all seeking God, trying to find our connections, all this difference in faith kind of washes away. And if it's something I had to address in dealing with interfaith groups or people in the Christian community who I admired, and I kept thinking, what is the faith that they're following? It's so different from mine. What does that say about my faith? And I stopped worrying about that. Once I started thinking about, we're all trying to work down the same path, to find our own way. So once you get to that point, then you can have good discussions. You can have open discussions. You're not defensive. You know we're all looking for the same thing, and we're just trying to find our way. And so we're trying to find our way. It doesn't involve Jesus, but doesn't mean we're both not on the same path.
It's interesting listening to Jenny because I think my experience is a little bit different from that in terms of, it's interesting because you're from a larger city, Savannah.
Much bigger than Selma.
Although it's interesting, Selma had a tremendous number of Jews at one point because the streets were lined with stores that were Jewish stores. But I don't feel exactly the same way because I went to Presbyterian Vacation Bible School every summer with my childhood playmate, and then went to Methodist. That's where I almost said that's where we had our fights about always. That wasn't true. It was just for comedy. But at any rate, I think, I remember coming home from Amy Grant's Christmas program one night that we went to once because some people took us to it, they'd gotten tickets to it, and we sang Christmas carols all the way home. And we know the words to all those songs. So I feel a little bit more, I shouldn't say I feel more Christian, but I feel more connected. I mean, after all, when the scribe asked Jesus what are the two most important laws, Jesus answers by saying, quotes from the Hebrew Bible. He answers with a Shema, with love the Lord thy God with all thy might, and he answers with the golden rule, basically. So that's the Jewish connection, and the many Jewish connection. The man was a Jew, and it's hard for me. I've read the New Testament. It's hard for me to read that without feeling he was a Jew. He was a different kind of Jew.
But you had somebody try to convert you.
Oh, I did. Yeah, I've had one of my very best friends in high school who told me, he said, we're really close friends now, but I'm not sure we're going to be able to be very close friends as we go on. And that was the beginning of an attempt to convert me, and he still sends me books. And guess what? He ain't going to make it. But at any rate, he does. And there are other people in my life that have told me that I'm going to hell and I'm not going to heaven, and don't I want to go to heaven and be with my family? Some of them, yes. But at any rate, you like that?
Well, we're cousins.
Oh, yeah, we're cousins. Jimmy and I are cousins. Jimmy's wife and I are cousins. So at any rate, but it's been that kind of struggle at times, yes.
Thanks for that response. Just one or two more questions from the list before we open it up. There were lots of questions submitted last week about how to be curious about Jews without giving offense or being too curious. So I'll ask two questions, and you can answer both or either. What basic things do we as Catholics, as Christians, need to know in order not to give offense when interacting with Jewish members of our community? And how can we engage in questions of faith, practice these things without giving offense?
Well, David and I thought, why would anybody be offended if someone comes to us in good faith and say, I would like to learn more. Would you be willing to have coffee and talk with us? If you come with, you don't believe in Jesus, why not? You're going to get a different response. But I can't imagine any Jewish person I know being offended if you said, help me understand, or I'd love to know more. We were a little quizzical about the question, because we Jews spend a lot of time talking about religious differences within our own faith in terms of how we practice or exactly what we believe. So we would welcome anybody that comes, as I say, in good faith and wants to know more. I don't get why anybody would care.
Yeah, but I think historically, Christians were very much separated from Jews. They weren't even allowed to go to the services, and because that was the other side being fearful that somehow they were going to be converted to Judaism. And that there are a lot of themes that linger on that I would ask people to evaluate about stereotypes and things like that. But this kind of thing just makes me feel good that John would put together a group of people that were interested in our Judaism, because I think that's the answer. When we realize, as Jimmy said, that we're all in this together, and the way we go about being in it together may be a little bit different. But I'm not saying to you guys you shouldn't pray the way you want to pray. And this is the kind of forum that allows it to go the other way. I brought 3 books with me today. May I say that? There are 3 books.
Did you write them? Are you selling them after the service? I ordered some, and they'll be over there.
No, I did
Not
not
these
write
books.
that. There are 3 books that I wanted to mention that contain so many of the tropes, so many of the stereotypes about Jews, and this has been perpetuated. The first one was the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was a counterfeit book that was written in 1903 in Russia, probably in Ukraine, and it's all about Jews wanting to take over the world and get all the money and be whatever. I mean, it's all the tropes that you hear going right now. The second one was The International Jew that was published by Henry Ford in 1920. He was a terrible anti-Semite. He really was. And he published this. The third one, which I couldn't find this morning, and since I'm a psychiatrist, I made something of that. I think I didn't want to bring it. And that's Mein Kampf, which was Hitler's book on Nazi Germany. If you look at these 3 books, you'll see all the tropes, all of the things that people use to discriminate against Jews. It is so embedded in the culture that it just makes me sick sometimes. But I wanted to bring those this morning because I wanted you to know that this is, for the most part, fabricated. Everybody wants to make a living. Everybody wants to live in a way that they feel secure.
Well, and I would say that, as Catholics, you all are, on the one hand, as I think you talked about, were perpetuators of anti-Semitism, but you're not far down the ladder of people that other people don't like at times. I mean, when we were growing up, Catholics were not, there were only a few Catholics, and the Klan didn't like Catholics any more than they liked Jews. So you have received in New England and many places a lot of the same discrimination, I think, that Jews have. So, it's kind of like we all need to stick together, but I think we do, in a sense, that to realize that along the way, most of us have been persecuted and stereotyped and discriminated against in one form or another, in one country or another. And unfortunately, as we are all too well aware, it's happening again in big time all over the world. And I don't know what we do about that, but this is a good place to start, John.
Last question for me then, and this goes to Jimmy. Along the lines of sticking together, can you think of any mutually accepted prayer that Jews and Catholics could pray together without giving offense to either and without putting either in an awkward place?
Well, any prayer that doesn't reference Jesus as the Lord and Savior is a prayer that would be welcome. So, I mean,
Like the Our Father?
so at any interfaith service, or people, the clergy must get together and talk about what is an acceptable prayer. But I think any prayer that's not exclusionary is going to be a welcome prayer. I mean,
Yeah, I think the Lord's Prayer, which in general doesn't mention Jesus, but it has become so associated with Christianity that makes that somewhat problematic. Jews have gone through that with a fine-tooth comb to find out what about it would be anti-Jewish, and nothing's anti-Jewish. I think when it says, Our Father who art in heaven, we don't necessarily believe God is in heaven. The whole heaven thing is something that everybody thinks differently about. So it would need to be a prayer that wasn't probably from the Christian testaments. And again, we don't like to say the Old Testament and the New Testament, because if our testament's old, that means it's out of date and no good anymore. So that's one of those things I think most Christians don't think about when they talk. So we would prefer to say the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. So something not that, but I think you can make up just about anything you want, and it would be great. Asking for peace and strength and unity of all peoples, and we would welcome that.
John, I think anyone in this room could write a prayer that could be used by both religions. I know I haven't done that a number of times in groups where I wanted it to be neutral, and it's very easy to do. It's just a matter of wanting to do it.
Okay, you have 15 minutes to come up with that prayer, okay? Questions? Who's got a question? Bob.
I've often heard it said, and I've heard it said by Jewish people, I am culturally Jewish, but I'm not religiously Jewish. Can you respond to how that hits you?
I'm sorry, what was the first word?
So the question was, and it was in here,
Really Jewish.
Oh, culture, Jewish.
some people identify as cultural Jews versus religious Jews. And I think it's true in any faith group. There are some people that are more adhere to ritual and than others. And I think there are people who, at least Jews, who question the existence of God and are questioning the value of organized religion. And so they would identify themselves as cultural Jews, meaning they like the food, they like the history, they like the Yiddish maybe, or the music, whatever it is. They still identify themselves as Jewish, but have distanced themselves from the ritual and the organized religion aspects. To non-Jews, all Jews are the same, right? So Hitler didn't distinguish between a practicing Jew and a non-practicing Jew. Jews were Jews based on race and genetics. But within the Jewish community, it's like any faith group, I think, you have people at different parts of the spectrum as far as their adherence to ritual and practice, and some that would just view themselves as Jews who like the cultural aspects of it.
There's one thing to mention here is there is a movement in Judaism that's very active and has been since in the last century, and of course continues. There was a rabbi named Mordecai Kaplan who started a branch of Judaism called the Reconstructionist movement, and that movement was centered around Jewish culture. It was considered a branch of Judaism, and there's still many reconstructive synagogues around that are primarily intent on culture. Although we went to one in Atlanta, and it was probably more than the temple. I mean,
There's also a group that call themselves humanist Jews, and they don't believe in God. But they still say that they're Jews because they believe in the goodness of all humanity, and they would adhere to things like the Ten Commandments. They would probably have to celebrate Passover and Hanukkah and things like that. So within Judaism, you have a wide spectrum from the ultra Orthodox to these humanist Jews, the cultural Jews, that would be possibly on the other end.
Thanks for the question, Bob, and thanks for your responses. Other questions? Yes.
The three of y'all, none of y'all grew up in Nashville. I know that you know a lot of people here.
a little louder.
I heard
I'm sorry.
We didn't grow up in
You
Nashville.
know a lot of people who did grow up in Nashville, and my feeling from conversations with some of those folks is that growing up in Nashville, a bigger place, wasn't quite as, the assimilation is not quite so complete, and they felt like they were excluded from a lot of things. And I wonder if you just might comment on that.
Yeah, I think we said earlier, I think you came in maybe just after that, Towns, that it was different in bigger cities. They did have, you were not accepted in country clubs here. You weren't accepted in a lot of the schools. You weren't accepted way back in some, like in the city of Belmead. I mean, there were a lot of places that did not allow Jews to be members. And I think you found that in Atlanta, probably, to some extent, maybe in a different way in New Orleans. New Orleans is its own thing. But in bigger cities that had the ability and where there were more Jewish people, because Jews had their own country club here. And they, Vanderbilt had a quota. It wasn't just in the South. I mean, there were places in New York you couldn't live, or in Chicago.
In Nashville.
And, yeah, that's it. So the bigger the city, the more the Jews, the more the Catholics, the more Poles. I mean, you had your ghettos, if you will, and you had the areas of town that were redlined for sure. And blacks. I just had found something online that there was like a green book for blacks where they could stay. There was one for Jews where they could stay, hotels that they could stay in, because there were signs that said no dogs, no blacks, no Jews. So it was not that different.
And there are pockets of assimilation. I came here originally on the faculty at Vanderbilt. So that Vanderbilt's pretty assimilated. I ran into a couple of things, and people would tell me stories, but it was very assimilated. So really, the first friends we had were not only Jewish in Nashville, but that kind of assimilated group of people. So that's important too, Towns.
Other questions? We still have a little time left.
Come on, somebody's got it.
Yes, please.
As you were growing up, how did your parents broach the Holocaust with you?
They didn't. It was something, I don't think, in the Jewish community in general that was talked about almost until, it's kind of like a death when it's so overwhelming you're just in shock, and you just get through it at first, and it takes you a while to get to the point that you can really talk about it. I think it was so overwhelming that it was something that it wasn't talked about, and at least in my home. In David's, it was a little bit different.
Yeah,
it wasn't talked about in schools. It wasn't talked about in general in society. I think it was just too unbelievable, and the people that had been in the war and in the camps, and they didn't. I truly can't remember when I first became aware of it. It would have been later. And we had people in Selma that were refugees. And so I knew they were there. David's family was more integrated with those people. They took care of them, so you were more aware than I was.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, Jimmy.
Yeah, I think that was my mother's personality traits, which were very caregiving. And I think it was my father's, having come from Nashville, Poland, and still having family over there, many of whom went to Israel. And we met only in the last 10 years. that had been, some of them had been wiped out by the Nazis. But that we had seemed to have more connection. And my childhood playmate tells me that she remembers us sitting on our front porch in Selma, and when the news actually came through that the Jews were in concentration camps, because it was kept secret for a long time, that they all cried. And I don't remember that, but she still tells me that that happened, and I imagine it did. I imagine it just was too overwhelming for me to remember. But my experience in my family is very different from Len. Len's family was actually more reformed than my family was.
And
Yeah.
tried very hard to be integrated into the society in many ways. But we were all still Jewish. I mean, it was very weird when you stop and think about it.
Well, for me, the Marx side of the family had immigrated from Germany during the 1850s or so. So that whole side of the family had been here many years before the Holocaust. On my mother's side, they started immigrating after World War I. And so they still had family in Europe at that time. But the Holocaust and World War II in general was not talked about for a long time in our household. My father didn't want to talk about it, and they wanted to move on and build their lives here. Not a topic of conversation. It has become. We were talking about cultural Jews, and a lot of people try to figure out trying to figure out their Jewish identity. Where do they find their identity? And for some, it is the Holocaust. I mean, you now have the museums, you have the remembrances. It has become a part of their Jewish identity is not forgetting. For others, it's Israel. Israel has become the focal point of their Jewish identity. They're very active in the Federation, which is a fundraising organization to send money to Israel. And for some, it's the food, but everybody tries to find their identity. And for some, it is this focal point has become the memories in the Holocaust, because pretty much we've lost all the people who were survivors. They're dwindling every year. I think we're having someone come. There's a Holocaust Commission that's based in Nashville, and they're bringing someone. He's 100 years old, and so he's going to be speaking. He's a Holocaust survivor, but pretty soon we won't have any people who lived through it, and so we're trying to there's been an effort to capture their memory. And for some, that is their Jewish identity.
Thanks. Any last comments before we close?
May I make one?
Yes.
Quickly. I think Catholicism is a very complex religion. And I went to school in New Orleans and med school and did my training in New Orleans. And so I've had a lot of exposure to Catholicism. And I've found many parts of it difficult to understand and many parts of it very easy to understand. I think Judaism is a very complicated religion. And it's an interesting religion to try and understand. I'm still trying to understand my own Judaism. And I think we could say that of almost any religion. But I really want to thank you folks for being interested in this. It makes me feel so good.
I too want to iterate, and Patty couldn't be here today. She's a little under the weather. We want to, again, thank you for putting this together. And Carolyn, thank you for pulling us in. I hope that, and I've spoken with Rabbi Danziger at our congregation, and I think y'all started to communicate. I hope we can build from this some sort of ongoing interaction. I think to those who are interested, if you're interested in attending a Shabbat service, you'd be more than welcome. The rabbis will take you through before and after, and I think it'd be maybe a way to just introduce you to our congregation. But then I hope we can come up with some ongoing follow-up, whether it's scripture study or whatever. It'd be wonderful. So I hope we can use this as a starting point.
And I too don't think that there are any questions that we would be uncomfortable with being asked. So John has all of our contact information. If you want to call and say, following the meeting, I questioned or I thought or I wondered, give us a holler. Any of us, I think, would be more than happy to speak with any of you because we very, very much appreciate your interest and desire to learn more.
I think by now, I would be delighted to talk to you.
And we would very much appreciate it.
Well, on behalf of Christ the King, I can assure you that we are committed to these next steps, field trips, back and forth, Q&A, scripture studies. We look forward to much more. David, would you be willing to close us with a prayer?
Yes, I would. Dear God, I want to thank you for giving us as human beings the ability to sit in a room and get to know each other, to know that we are created in your image, and to know that we are all more alike than different. I thank you for allowing this what I consider a very good dialogue to occur, to allow us to know each other better. I must mention the terrible situation in Israel, and I hope, dear God, that you will bring all your powers to that, to bring peace to Israel and to extend that to the entire world. Thank you, God. Amen.
Amen.